Exactly. All right.
Okay, let us start learning today's daf Samach Gimel 63 in Masechet Menachot, and the Mishnah, or the Mishnah, the top word on daf Samach Gimel Mid Aleph, Haomer Harei Alai b'machavat. Person says, I want to bring a. Now we think this means a mincha in a machavat. Lo yavi b'marcheshet. You shouldn't bring it a marcheshet. Remember, we've had, of course, the 10 or so types of menachot. Two of the classic ones. We're going to have these, of course, in the Parshiot coming up. Now that we're at Vayikra, are machavat and marcheshet. And the general idea is that a machavat is a flatter uh, cake, like a pancake maybe, and a marcheshet is a deep fried kind of thing. It's a deeper thing. Now we'll see the details. Of course, we don't know exactly. We'll see the details. But if you say I'm going to bring a mincha and a machavat, and you shouldn't bring it in a marcheshet, but marcheshet lo yavi b'machavat. Ask the Mishnah, what's the difference? Ma bein machavat the marcheshet. A marcheshet ish kisui. So unlike what I just told you about deep fried, which is one of the opinions, the Tanakhama says the difference is that a marcheshet has a covering. So you put oil in a pan, I guess, you put your flour in your water, you start cooking it, but you cover it. And by covering it, of course, you keep the moisture in and things rise a little bit and it gets a little moister. And so it's doughier as opposed to a machavat in la kisoy. A machavat, there's no cover, and so it doesn't have a kisoy. There's a big machloket. Rashi seems to hold that the thing that matters here is the pan, meaning that basically you're taking the same mixture of dough, and the question is, do you make it in one form or another form? But there's really nothing different about the mincha before you go to the pan in a machavat or a marcheshet, right? It's a way of cooking it. There are others who understand that you use different kind of prepared dough, like the Rambam, based on whether you're going to put it in a machavat or a marcheshet. But either way, the Tanakhama of the Mishnah says the difference is whether there's a covering on the pan. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Omer, Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel seems to argue, and he says, well, no, a difference is that a marcheshet, which again is referring here to the pot of a marcheshet, it's a muka. It is deep, meaning it's a deep pot. It's not a flat kind of thing, like a griddle or something. It's deep. Umaaseh rochashim. And it's the way it's done, it's rochesh. Now, rochesh means that it's a little bit spongy, I guess is one way to translate it. All these words are a little bit tricky to translate. But maaser rochashim. And so what ends up coming out of the product is something that's a little looser, essentially. Um, and sorry, where am I? And and Machavat is tsafa. It floats basically. So it's like a flat, where you cook on top of it. I've heard a lot of people like a waffle maker, right? You heat on top of it. And maser kashim, it turns out to be something harder because it doesn't sit in the oil, it doesn't absorb, and so it's a more hard kind of flat thing. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, my time in Rabbi Yossi. Now, what is the reason for Rabbi Yossi who says that it goes with a top or not having a top? So maybe it's from the word itself. The word marcheshet has implications, the atiyah aruchushe halev, that it comes for things of the heart, the turmoil of the heart, right? The richush, the things in the heart. Kidichtiv rachash libi davar tov, that my heart is thinking or is considering good things. So maybe that's what marcheshet means. It means things in the heart. Umachavat atiyah chubei peh. Machavat comes for speaking of the mouth. So, right, if you say something inappropriate, you say lashon hara, you talk about someone, you lie, you steal, these kind of things. That's where you do a machavat, right? And so the words themselves seem to imply different types of one's an internal, where you therefore have a cover, right? So you have to hide it because it's the heart, and one is basically external; it's on the surface. So maybe that's the difference, right? Says more, but if that's the truth, Kedam Inchi, sorry, as people say, minabchi nebuchi, my lips are moving, which is something external. But the truth is, you can, with words very often, you could do the opposite. Ema ibcha. Maybe you could say the opposite, which is machavat is the atiyah lev, right? The word machui means hidden. So a machavat comes from what is hidden in the heart. And dichtiv lama nechbeta livra, as what's his name? Yisro said to Yaakov, why have you hidden to run away? And marcheshet atiyah chushe. Marcheshet actually comes for speaking. Right, the opposite. Kedami inchi havi merachshin siftatayo. My lips are moving. Ella says, you can't, the words are quite fluid. The word marcheshet can have many implications that imply hidden or revealed. Machavat can mean both. Ella Gemara Gemirla, it means he had a tradition. This is what Rabbi Yossi Aglili was taught by his teachers, that A marcheshet is a covered pot. A machavat is an uncovered pan or whatever, and that's the difference between them. So that's the first opinion. The second opinion is Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Omer at the two dots. We welcome Nava on board. It's good to have you. Marcheshet amuka, right? Rabbi Yossi Aglili said, oh, sorry, Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel said a marcheshet is a deep pan, right? And the difference is that you basically fry in the oil like a deep dish kind of thing, or
Like a
like
French
a
fry.
maybe, yeah. I mean, obviously they didn't have deep fried in those days. They didn't have these big machines like we have, but that's the concept, right? Where you load up with oil and you put cakes inside of it. There's all kinds of things that we eat. I think on Pesach we eat things like this that are made that way. They're like yeah. Anyways, you fry it in oil, right? So like donuts almost. So says
Been
Rebbe.
laying up for Pesach.
Not right, correct. Thanks for the reminder. Um, Says Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, sorry, Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, sorry, wrong person. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, that Amar Chesed is Amukan. You know how I know it says Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel? It's not from the words and implies this or that. It's dichtiv because the pasuk says B'kol Naaseh bim Mar Chesed. You make a mincha in the Mar Chesed, which implies you put it into a pot. And look at machavat. The words are very different. Machavat is a flat thing where basically you heat up the bottom and you cook on the surface. It's tzafa, it floats, meaning it sits on the top. Dichtiv al machavat. So it's very interesting. You didn't pay that much attention when you read in the pasuk that one says in a marcheshet, and the other says on a machavat, which tells you that the way you cook on them is different. Tanarabanan says the Braita, these are really confusing because think of this. Beit Shammai Omrim. Beit Shammai said, let's say Omer Hare Alai Marcheshet. Person says, I want to bring a marcheshet. Now that's a big problem because we don't know, and this is why it's been so challenging, in case you didn't know, why it's been so difficult, whether a marcheshet refers to the pan of a marcheshet or the mincha of a marcheshet, right? Because and this is what I mentioned earlier. That according to Rashi, there's really no difference in the dough of these two things. It's just you make the mincha in a marcheshet or in a machavat. But you said, I want to bring a marcheshet. Now that could mean bring a mincha marcheshet, or it could mean donate a pan to the Beit HaMikdash called a marcheshet, right? So it says Beit Shammai, we have no idea what to do. And if you set aside $50 to do this karban, you can't. And remember, Beit Shammai was in the time of Beit HaMikdash, so he could have done something. But it says Beit Shammai, Yehei munach ad sheyavo Eliyahu. You have to let the money sit until Eliyahu comes and clarifies it for you. Because Misafklu, he was uncertain. Iyal shum kli nikru. If it's a marcheshet because of the kli, al shum masehem, or because of the way it was prepared. Meaning, is a mincha marcheshet a mincha that is made in a fashion that is doughy and fluffy? In which case, you say, "I'll bring a marcheshet. I'm bringing a doughy, fluffy thing," or is a mincha marcheshet a mincha that's regular flour and oil. Let's put in a marcheshen, in which case a marcheshen is an object. So that was Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel Omrim, no. Beit Hillel says it's pretty clear that a marcheshet is a kli. Kli hayabe mikdash or marcheshet shmo. And what did it look like, this marcheshet? So I don't know the answer. And the picture in Rashi I don't think is very helpful, but others might have other pictures. But says Beit Hillel, dome kimin kalbus amuk. It was like a deep kalbus. I don't know what a kalbus is. I have an art scroll so I can read what he says, or they say. Kalbus, they say, is a deep tongues, right? Rashi does say that. It looks like tongues. I don't know why that
Meaning
means.
10 miles?
Miriam, do you have an art scroll by any chance?
Yeah, I'm trying to find
So,
Calbus.
you see this picture on number
Yeah,
8?
it does say deep tongues. There is no picture. The only picture they have is like the oh yeah. No, actually there is.
Yeah, see that picture? I have the art scroll too. I
Oh,
have
you
it.
do. Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So yeah, it's not like the picture in Rashi. Maybe that's what they wanted to put in Rashi, but
This is the Rashi picture?
this is the Rashi picture. You have it down there.
Because
So, anyways, it's spread out, and it's not clear why you have tongues. Like if it's you have to hold it somewhere, but basically, remember when you made a mincha, you would take the isaron of soled and you would have ten chalot. Right? A
Okay.
mincha was made into 10 different loaves, each mincha. So you took the amount of flour, you didn't make one loaf. You made 10. So you see in this picture in Rashi, or at least the art scroll picture of Rashi, you have multiple spots there where each of those indentations becomes a ball, basically, a loaf. Let's read inside the Gemara what it says. So Beit Hillel says it was a kamin kalbus amok. It was like these deep tongues. Ukeshabatzeik munach b'tocho, when you put the dough into the kalbus, Dome came in tapuchei bruchim. It was like these little apples, these Barotian apples. I don't know what those mean. Maybe they're small apples or something, but it looks like these tiny little apples. So meaning they were roundish shapes of your dough, which is what you do for baking, right? Ukamin balute yavanim, and it looked like the Greek acorns is how he translates it. Again, I don't. Some say it means that there was like a little bit of a top on top of them. But anyways,
Meat?
what?
What is Rashi say?
That there was like a little top on it that like an acorn, which has a little top. But either way,
Meat?
either way, yeah, that it curved in and then it was open on top. So that was what they looked like. The Omer, and it says in the pasuk, "V'chol naaseh b'marcheshet ve'al machavat." Right? It says in the Torah what you make in a marcheshet, what you make on a machavat. Alma al shum hakelim nikru v'lo al shum maasehem. So you see that the name marcheshet and machavat is based on a kli, and therefore says Beit Hillel, if you walk into the Beit Hamikdash and say, "I'm giving a marcheshet," it means you're giving the pan. That's a marcheshet. If you say Harei alai mincha marcheshet, obviously that means something different. And if you say Harei alai bim marcheshet, then it means I'm brewing the thing in the marcheshet, which means the mincha. That's what you're supposed to say. Okay, says the next Mishnah, the third mincha, which is what we call ma'afei tanur. Now, most people are familiar with an oven. I'm least familiar in this crowd, but
I think you should say
but
it. I
sorry.
don't think you're less familiar than me.
Okay, so I mean I know about Gemara ovens, but anyway, so ma'afei tanur means you bake something in an oven. If you recall, we've discussed this several times before, is that the Torah refers to chalot and rikikim, right? Chalot mean like challah,
Rise.
it's rising. The rikikim are flat,
Pancakes.
and the difference, I mean, they're like wafers, like matzah almost. Then there's a big debate about how you make the difference. Rashi usually says that chalot have oil added inside of them, so you put oil into the dough, which I guess makes it more generous and fluffy, and it rises. Not necessarily rising. It's not chametz, right? Remember, you're not allowed to have chametz, but it means that it has more depth to it. And the rikikim have less oil or no oil,
So
and
chal is like the Sephardi matzah? Or it's like
yeah, but
lafai?
I mean, lafas don't have oil, but yeah, same idea. Okay, so remember we said before, the Torah says you could bring mafei tanur chalot and mafei tanur rikikim. The question is, can you do half and half? And we've had this debate before. We're going to have it again in our Mishnah. Says the Mishnah. A person says, Harei alai b'tanur. I want to bring a mincha in an oven. Lo yavima fe kupach. You can't do a kupach. Now, a kupach is a mini oven. It's like a portable stove. So remember, the regular ovens, not regular, were a big piece of clay or whatever you made an oven out of. You put coals inside of it or underneath it, and then you would put your bread on the side, on the wall of the oven, right? Now you can do that. You also had holes, remember, on the top of the oven where you could put a pot, which we talked about on Shabbos, right? Putting the pot in, taking the pot off. So what the general way you would make bread was you'd put on, which they do today, obviously, still, if you walk by the shuk, right? Is they put the dough on the wall of the oven and it bakes, right? And it's a big skill to figure out how to put it on the right way and how to take it off the right way. And,
Yeah, it looks like a big lava.
it's like a big lava, correct.
Yeah.
But there's different depths in it, right? So some are
Right.
fuller than, imagine, again, if you add things to a laffa, which again, I've never personally cooked, but if you add oil, it cooks different than if you don't add oil, probably, right?
I guess. Yeah.
Presumably. Um,
Right.
anyway, but a kubach is a small oven, and it's not the same as a tanur. So you're not yotze if you put it on a kubach. Rashi just says it's a smaller oven, right? It has one opening instead of two openings. Okay, that's the first part of the Mishnah. V'lo ma'afei re'afim. Now you also can't bake it in a way of re'afim, which I'm just going to read here the English because the Gemara will talk about it a little bit, but I don't know what all these things are. The article says re'afim are tiles where you heat up clay. And so you don't actually put it in an oven, but you put it on heated things and you put the dough on top of this heated surface.
Oh, like a calorimeter.
Okay, like a limiter. Thank you. V'lo ma'aseh ra'afim. V'lo ma'aseh, where am I? V'ma'afei yorot arvim. And the yorot of the arvim, which are the Arabian cauldrons, right? So same kind of idea, which is basically they would heat up these large pots, right? And then they would put the dough into them, but there was actually no fire. So it wasn't an oven, it was just a heated pot, basically, which was enough to cook, right? It just wasn't an oven. So those you're not Yotze. Rabbi Yehuda says, forget about where you cook it. But remember, Ratzah, this is Rabbi Yehuda we've quoted many times before. Ratzah mevim, I'm sorry, I take it back. We'll get to Rabbi Yehuda in a second. Ratzah mevim ma'afei kupach. Says Rabbi Yehuda, I disagree. You're not allowed to use these cauldrons and stuff and tiles, but you can put in a kupach because a kupach is an oven. It's just a mini oven. It's like a mini toaster, a toaster oven, right?
A
That's what,
George Foreman.
not a George Foreman. It's like a toaster oven. It's different between an oven, which is a full size, and a toaster oven. Okay. Harei alai minchat ma'afeh. Now, to the second halacha of the Mishnah. If you say, I want to bring a minchat ma'afeh, lo yavi mechza chalot mechza rikikim. You got to choose. Either you bring chalot, which are made with oil and they're bigger, or you make rikikim, which are flatter. You can't do half and half, right? And again, the way you would do half and half is you would take your dough and you would cook half of it one way and half of another way. It's not, remember, there's a lot of dough, right? So you can't do that. Rabbi Shimon matir mipnei shu karban echad. Rabbi Shimon says, no, no problem. It's one karban, the mincha mafei tanur, it can be chalot, it can be rikikim, it can be half and half, and it can be five and three, five and whatever, seven and three, or six and four. It can be any ratio. Now, Tanu Rabbanan says the Braita. What's the source of this discussion? It says in the pasuk you should make a mincha ma'afei tanur. The Torah is very clear how you bake it in the oven. Velo ma'afei kupach. Right? You can't bake it any other way. You can't do it in a kupach, which is a mini oven. Velo ma'afei ra'afim. You can't do it on the tiles that we said. Velo ma'afei yorot arvim. You can't do it in these deep cauldrons. I like Rashi's other pshat. I don't know if it's another pshat, which is that they were actually clay that you put underground and you would heat up, and basically it would stay very insulated because there's dirt all around it. And so I guess you put coals in it and then take out the coals, and then this remains this really hot thing.
Like how you cook in a
Wait.
campfire when you like throw a potato in.
Right, but there's flames. Here the point is there's no actual fire, right? You heated up the pan, the clay earthenware pot,
And then
right?
you put it
And
in
then you
the earth
remove the
hot.
fire and it stays in the earth and remains hot for a long time. Anyways, it's I don't know. This is how people cooked when they had trouble with outlets back then. So that's the Breita, which says exactly what our Mishnah said. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I disagree that you're allowed to use a kupach. You know why? Because it says tanur tanur shnei pa'amim. The Torah says by mafei tanur, it says it twice. It says the word tanur twice. And so lachshir mafei kupach, it's being inclusive that there's many types of tanurim, even a kupach. Rabbi Shimon says that I disagree with that because it says tanur tanur shnei pa'amim to tell you echad shetei afiyat dan b'tanur. One is telling you that you have to bake this karban mincha in a tanur. That's obvious. Ve'echad shehekteshan b'tanur. That you have to make it. The tanur itself has to make it kodesh, meaning the mincha becomes kodesh with kedushat haguf once you put it in the tanur. Says, is that true? Is mi'itli Rabbi Shimon high svara? Does Rabbi Shimon hold that? But now we're going to have a mishnah later in the Masechta. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon says, "La'olam havi ragil omer." If you're thinking of things that you should always be saying, you should always remember this principle. You ready? Shtei alechem ulechem apanim ksherut ba'azara. That the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim, which are karbanot mincha, are kosher to be baked in the azara, but ksherut bebeit pagi. They're even kosher to bake them out in Beit Pagi. We use Beit Pagi often as like all the way out there. It was the far reaches of Yerushalayim, which might have been a 10-minute walk for all you know. But the far reaches of Yerushalayim were Beit Pagi, right? And says Rabbi Shimon, you can bake your mincha there. Now, how can you bake a mincha there if the mincha becomes kodesh kedushat haguf when you bake it, and a member of karban is not allowed to leave? So the second you made your mincha, it would be outside Yerushalayim,
Great question.
outside the Beit Hamikdash, and you'd be puzzled. So clearly, baking it is not kedushat haguf. So what does he mean? Says the Rava Ema, what he doesn't mean that you make it kodesh in the tanur. It means shehekdeshan l'shum tanur. He means that when you make the carbon kodesh, when you dedicate your flour and your oil, you should say, I'm doing this for the purpose of a mafei tanur. Meaning, it's not enough just to say, I'm doing a mincha, I'll decide later what kind of mincha. Right? At the time that you dedicate the mincha, you have to dedicate which kind of mincha you're doing. So
And what
that's
would you
what.
say if you were doing it outside and the Beit Pagi?
No, you would say I'm bringing this for a mincha, but you don't make it kedushat haguf until you come to the azara and you put it in the pot in the azara called the biza that we had before. So it's not kodesh when you bake it. It's anyways. Tosas here is very bothered by this concept because it really sounds here like you're baking the mincha before you bring it to the Beit Hamikdash, right? Which you do by shtei alechem. Remember we've talked about shtei alechem. You bake them ahead of time, right? But you don't necessarily do that by every other mincha. So Tosas discusses that a little bit here.
The Torah.
And the Torah. Harei alai mincha ma'afei. We're at the two dots, 6 lines from the bottom. If you say I'm going to bring a minchat ma'afei, you shouldn't bring, according to the Tanakama, which we're going to see as Rabbi Yehuda, I think, you shouldn't bring half and half. Okay, so let's read that inside. Tanur Rabbanan says the Braita. Let's analyze the psukim of minchat ma'afei tanur. It says v'chi takriv. Right? And we don't have the whole psukim in the Gemara, but I have it on the side, if I can read that small. V'chi takriv karban mincha ma'afei tanur, solat chalot matzot b'lot b'shemen, that's one, Urikike matzot meshuchim bashamen, right? So it's solet matzot, it's matzah, and it's rikikim. So kishet takriv. Now it says the Braita, it says v'chi takriv. You know what chi takriv means? When you decide you want to bring a karban. Kishet takriv. When you decide you want to do it, lasso to do it, divar reshut. This is a voluntary karban. There's no chiyuv ever to do a minchat mafei tanur. It's a voluntary thing. You decide I want to do it. It's not where you have to do it, right? So that's the first principle. The second is karban mincha. When it says the words karban mincha, says Rabbi Yehuda, minayin la'omer harei alai minchat ma'afei shlo yavi mechza chalot u'mechza rikikim. How do you know that if you say, this is Rabbi Yehuda, the Tanakh in our Mishnah, how do you know that if you say, I'm going to bring a minchat ma'afei, you can't do half and half? Talmud lomar, karban mincha. It is a karban, meaning, karban echad amarti l'chavlo shnayim shalosh karbanot. You bring one type of thing. So it's you can bring, you have a choice. It could be chalot or rikikim, but it's one. That's Rabbi Yehuda's drasha from the word karban mincha. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon, says Rabbi Shimon, Daf Samach Gimel Amud Bet, V'chinemar karban shnei pa'amim, right? Says Rabbi Shimon, it's a question. Does it say karban two times? Remember, I read the pasuk. I'll read it again if we want to. It says v'chi takriv karban mincha, and then it says mafei tanur, solet chalot, matzot b'lo bashamen, erikikei matzot meshuchim bashamen. It doesn't repeat karban mincha a second time. There are clearly two types of karbanot here. One is chalot and one is rikikim. But it doesn't say karban shnei pa'amim, v'alolo nemer el karban echad, which is confusing, but it means it only says karban echad one time, right? Karban echad echad, right? It only says karban echad once. The nemar bo, and it says about that one karban, chalot rikikim, right? So it says both a type of chalot and rikikim, which are different. These are different things. Me'ata. So what I learn from here, or what I conclude from here, is ratza lahavi chalot, maybe. If you want to bring chalot, you can bring them. Rikikim, maybe. If you want to bring rikikim, you can bring them. And you can mix and match. Mechza chalot, mechza rikikim, maybe. You can put them together. You can bring them together. Now, of course, it's a little tricky because how in the world are you going to do the kmitza, right? So remember, you bring the loaves, then you have to take the kmitza. Which one do you take? So remember that before you do the kmitza, we're going to get into this later, you would grind up the loaves back into pieces, right? You do patototo pitim, you would put them back into pieces to take off the kmitza. So what you would do is bolalan, you would mix them together, the kometz mishnehem, and you would take a kmitza from the combined pieces of these two rikikim and chalot, which will look a little bit different, right? Pieces of challah are different than pieces of matzah. But you take a handful. And im kamatzva labi adome echad al shnehem yatza. And if you take a handful and you get all matzah or all rikikim or all, it's okay. That's fine. It's one karban. So that is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Yehuda says it says karban echad. They have to be one type. Rabbi Shimon says it says karban echad. I agree with you, but it says two types in that karban echad. So clearly they're both parts of one karban. There's a third opinion now in the Brighton. The third opinion is related to one of the first opinions. That is Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, Omer. So Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, the son of the Tanakama Rabbi Yehuda, chimes in and says, it sounds like, well, you'll see what he says. Omer, minayin la Omer. How do you know that a person who says, Arelai minchat ma'afei, shelo yavi mechza chalot u'mechza rikikim, which is exactly what his father said, right? So how do you know that a person who brings a mincha ma'afei can't bring half and half? Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says the following: the chol mincha. This is a complicated, convoluted, and interesting shot. It says Rabbi Yehuda, what's his name? Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. If you look at the Torah, and this is, I pay attention this week, right? Because this is all this week's parsha. The Torah has sets of menachot. They're sets. They're pairs, basically. Let's read inside what the pairs are. It says chol mincha asher te'afeh b'tanur. That's one set, where we'll see why. And it says, "V'kol naaseh b'marcheshet v'al machavat." Anything you do in a marcheshet, as we talked about before, in a pan, or on a machavat, la kohen hamakrivoto lo tiyah. That should go to the kohen. V'chol mincha b'lulav Hashem v'chareva l'chol b'nei Aaron tiyah. Right? Every mincha that you do that's b'lulav Hashem, which is one, and that's chareva, which is dry, goes to the kohen. So if you think about it, says Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, very interesting. The Torah says machavata marcheshet, that's two. It says chareva and belula, that's two. But the first set was only one, was only mincha of mafei tanur. Says Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, clearly minchat mafei tanur is two minachot. And it has to be one and one. It can't be three minachot. It can't have four options. There's two options. The Torah is giving you sets of two. It's a beautiful reading of the Torah. Let's read that inside. Where am I?
Like cool.
Ma v'chol ha'amor lamata, just like everything that says below, meaning everything after minchat ma'afei tanur, shnei minin chalukim, it's two different things, right? Machavat and marcheshet is one pair. Belula and chariva, dry and oil and moist with oil, is one pair. Af v'chol ha'amor lemala shnei minim. So, chalukim. So too, when it says the word vichol, it means two different types. So vichol minchat ma'afei tanur means two distinct minchot ma'afei tanur. Beautiful, beautiful reading of the pasuk. Beautiful proof. But of course, his father already said this halacha from a different source. So says we're going to ask in a second why we have to say it a second time. But before we ask that question, says the Gemara, but Rabbi Yehuda shaper kamer Rabbi Shimon, right? Rabbi Yehuda initially said it said karban echad, right? And it means one time. And Rabbi Shimon said, yeah, it says karban echad. And clearly there's two ways to do the karban echad, right? So that's a good question. Amar lecha, Rabbi Yehuda would say to Rabbi Shimon, "Given dichtiv bashemen, since it doesn't say karban echad twice, but it says the words bashemen twice. So therefore, kaman dichtiv karban karban dami. So it's as if it says karban two times. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yehuda's answer to Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, that's not an answer. Because ilo ktiv b'shema b'shemen. If it didn't say b'shemen b'shemen, hava mina, I would have thought dafka mechza chalot mechza rakikim. I actually would have read this pasuk, and think about it when you read the parsha this week. I would have read it saying you have to bring 50% chalot, 50% rikikim. Because the Torah doesn't say or, it says this and this. So I would have thought that avo chalot lechudai or kikim lechudai emalo. I would not have known that you can bring just chalot or just rikikim. Kamash malan, that's why it says bashemen to tell you that they're separate. But since karban is one, it only says karban one time, it is one overriding karban. And so therefore you can bring anything you want within that karban. Okay, that was Rabbi Shimon's opinion.
So you can.
Rabbi Shimon says you can. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't. Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says it's great shot. There's only pairs, and it's a pair, and you can't do two. Says Gemara, thank you, Rabbi Yehuda. But what about your father? Rabbi Yehuda, hainu avua. It's exactly what your father said. So why do you need to add a new shot? Answers the Gemara, Ika beinayo di avad. The difference is the source, and the source matters whether you do it after the fact. Avad, if you did it in, bidiavad, that's where avad comes from, right? If you did it bidieved, as we would say, right? If you did it after the fact, what is it possible? So according to his father, Rabbi Yehuda, it's kosher because it just says the word karban. It's supposed to be a karban, but bidiavad, it's okay. But according to the son, Rabbi Yehuda, everything has to be pairs. Absolutely, there's two minachot. There's not a minchat ma'afei tanur. There's a mincha rakik ma'afei tanur and a mincha chala ma'afei tanur. There's not two karbanot. And so if you bring, I'm saying there's not one karban. So if you bring 5 chalot of one and 5 of the other, you did half of each mincha. It's like doing half of a machavat and half of a marcheshet. And therefore it would be pasol, even b'diavad, you'd have to do it again. Hadron alach kol haminachot. Okay, now we get up to the 6th parak. And the 6th parak, Rabbi Yishmael talks about a very special mincha. We're getting into a very special minachot here. I keep doing my words wrong. And this is one that's very relevant. The next one coming up in our calendar, which is the Minchat HaOmer. The Minchat HaOmer, which is brought on the 2nd day of Pesach, right? And the Minchat HaOmer, unlike almost every mincha, is brought from seorin, is brought from the barley, right? Because the barley grew faster. The Minchat, the solet, the chita doesn't come out till Shavuot, which is the Shtei Alechem. And it's one of only 2 carbonot that's brought out of barley. What's the other one, Nava? The mincha, the sota, right? Because we want the sota to have, barley is considered to be inferior. So the grain is not as coarser, the dough is not as good. So the other one is the sota. But the mincha of the omer is brought on the 2nd day of Pesach, and it is done to be matir chadash, right? You can't eat new grain until you bring the mincha to omer. Now, a relevant halacha, which is going to come back over and over, is that the Minchat Omer was one of the flashpoints of disagreement between the Chachamim and the Tzedukim or the Baitusim, right? Who held that when the Torah says about bringing the Omer, it says, Mimacharat HaShabbat. Excuse me. Macharat HaShabbat, that you bring the Omer the day after Shabbat. Now, we understand that means the day after Pesach, the 2nd day of Pesach. But the Tzedukim, the Baitusim, read this very literally. It has to be after Shabbat. And so they would always try to organize that it happened on Sunday, which would be very nice if Pesach came on Shabbat. But Pesach does not often come on Shabbat. Like this year, it comes on Thursday, right? So they had a lot of disagreements about this, and therefore, very interestingly, when they did the service of the Omer in the Beit HaMikdash, they did everything they could to try to prove that the Baitusim are wrong, to show that we're right. So that reflects how we do it. So says the Mishnah now, Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Now the Omer, like most Menachot, not like most, like many, is an asirit to ephah, a tenth of an ephah of grain. Okay, so the way it works is you cut down the grain. This is Hilchos Shabbos, right? You have to do all the steps, the processing. You winnow it, you separate it, you crush it, you get the grain, and then you have to sift it, right, to get flour, because otherwise it's very coarse, right? You got all kinds of parts.
Sandy.
So they would take an ephah. An ephah is 3 sa'ah. Okay, so Rabbi Shmuel says that the Omer Hayabam b'Shabbat mishalosh sa'in. If it was Shabbos, you would cut down 3 sa'ah of grain, sift it to make an asirit ephah, which is 1/10 of 3 sa'ah. Okay, so basically you'd grind, you'd make the grain, and then you would sift it, so it's very fine. Only the top 10% would come be used for the mincha. But if it's a weekday, you would do chamesh. You would cut down 5 sa'ah of grain in order to make it. Now, to think about it logically, the more grain you have, the purer it's going to be, right? Because the more you have, you only need to take 2% or 5%. So, right, an asirit taifa of 5 sa'ah is 6%. An asirit taifa of 3 sa'ah is 10%. So if you need the top 6%, it's much cleaner grain, right? If you have the top 10%, you have to keep sifting it and going and working harder in order to get that grain. Okay? That flour. I keep saying grain. I mean flour, right? That flour. So on Chol, you would do 5, but on Shabbat, you would only do 3. And why would you only do 3 on Shabbat? So presumably, because no one really loves cutting down doing Chilul Shabbat, right? So the less Chilul Shabbat you can do, the better. That's what it seems to be the reason. So if you can cut down 3 and make enough fine flour for an Asir Teifa, you should do it. But during the week, you have to cut down even more. That's the Tanakh. That's Rabbi Yishmael. The Chachamim omrim echad Shabbat ve'echad Chol b'shalosh. The Chachamim say, no. Use 3 sa'ah, whether it's Shabbat or Chol, there's no difference. Shalosh Hayabah, sorry, came from 3. Rabbi Chanina Skanakonim Omer. Rabbi Chanina Skanakonim said, the process was very different on Shabbat and B'chol. B'Shabbat hayu niksar b'yachid, u'b'magal achad. On Shabbat, it was one individual who cut it down, because if you can minimize the number of people who have to be Michal Shabbat, that's better. And he would use one sickle, scythe, thank you. Ubekupa achad, and one big bucket. Kupa is like the container where you put the grain. Ubechol, but on the weekday, you'd have 3 people doing this. It was a 3-person job. Bishlosha, 3 people, shalosh kupot, shalosh magalot, 3 people with 3 scythes. And he says sickle in mine. Anyways, I don't know the difference. And 3 kupot. That's the.
So the Muschar.
Yeah, I mean, it's better. Brova Mahadras Melech, as we had yesterday, right? More people is better. But on Shabbat, you want to minimize the people doing Chilul Shabbat. And Rabbi and Chachamim say, no. Don't make any differences. The way you do it during the week is the way you do it on Shabbat. Echad Shabbat ve'echad Chol b'shlosha, b'shalosh kupot, u'b'shalosh magalot. So don't differentiate, right? This is Docha Shabbat. Obviously, it's Docha Shabbat. You're allowed to do korbanot on Shabbat that are korbanot tzibur. So do it the way you would do it during the week on Shabbat. Don't make any differences. So it says the Gemara, Bishlam Kosavi Rabbanan. The Rabbanan's opinion is very consistent, right? Their opinion is that in order to have a beautiful, fine isaron of solet, you need to start off with 3 sa'ah of grain. So do it on Shabbos, do it on the weekday. You never need to change. So Bishlam Rabbanan Kosavi isaron mufchar b'shlosha sa'inati, right? A good isaron comes from 3 sa'ah of grain. Lo shna Shabbat, lo shna b'chol, lo shna b'Shabbat. You don't change whether it's the week or it's Shabbat. Ela Reb Yishmael, the Tanakama, Micah Savar. What does he hold in terms of how you make good flour? Ika Savar Isaron Mufchar Lo Atil Michamesh. If he holds that the way to get a good Isaron is to have 5 sa'ah of flour to begin with, so then Afilo Shabbat Nami. Why can't? Well, you have to have 5 on Shabbat. You have to have a good Isaron. Imi Shaloshati, if you can do it from 3, which is how he says to do it on Shabbat. So why during the week do you have to cut down 5? Afilo Bechol Nami, just do it from 3. Right? So again, what is his opinion? Now, obviously, I spoke out in the Mishnah. His opinion is that you should treat Shabbat different than the Chol, but let's read that inside. Amar Rava, says Rava, well, Kasavar, Rabbi Yishmael is of the opinion that Isaron Mufchar below Tircha Atimi Chamesh, that without as much effort, you can get it from 5 sa'ah. I don't know if you've ever sifted flour, Nava, but I'm sure Miriam has sifted flour. It's an intense process, right? So if you take and whenever you sift, right, the first part that falls through the sifter is always very easy, right? Because some of it comes out right away. Like the very fine stuff is already coming through, then you have to do work in order to get the other part out. So says Rava in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, to get a really good isaron without a lot of work, meaning with minimal sifting, not none, but small amount, then you should have five. You have to have five sa. But bitircha, if you're going to work at it, you're going to grind and not grind, but put your elbow into it. Atimi shalosh, right? You can do it from three. So bechol during the weekday when we don't really care about how much you're cutting down, you can cut over. During the weekday, it's more, it's less of a burden, less of a pain. People are going to appreciate that you brought it out from five sa of solet. But b'Shabbat, mutav sheyarbeh b'mala achat b'harkada v'al yarbeh b'malachot harbe. On Shabbat, you have to do many melachot, right? Remember, from cutting down a grain to making bread is 11, I think 11 melachot, many, right? It's over 10 melachot. So you're going to be involved in many steps. But why don't you just focus on one called harkada, which is sifting, right? And do that excessively instead of doing extra cutting and winnowing and separating and all the other melachot that you can avoid if you instead of having five sa'ah, you have three sa'ah. So that's what Rabbi Shmuel holds. Amar Rabbah. Now, before I read the Rabbah, which we're going to read, obviously you can imagine this has tremendous implications for Chilul Shabbat, right? I mean, if you have to drive to the hospital on Shabbat, if you have to do whatever, the whole question of do you do one thing more or do you do many things a little bit, right, is very relevant to what they're doing in the mission. Okay, so I'm not going to. Obviously, we don't resolve it. So Machloket Tanaim, but the Gemara is about to give us. I think this is why the Gemara does this. It's about to give us many examples where there's a similar concept, where on Shabbat, and then we'll see non-Shabbat, do you do more of one Avera, or one thing wrong, in order to save other ones? So we're going to start with maybe one, because we'll see, because we do daf, so we don't finish the sugya. But it says Rabbah, 6 lines from the bottom, Rabbi Yishmael in our Mishnah, who says that you should cut down a smaller amount of flour on Shabbat, and do more work of Harkada rather than cut down more flour. And Rabbi Yishmael ben Osham Mebroko is not related, I don't think, but he has the same name. Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan Mebroka, Amru Davar Echad. They said one thing, meaning they have the same concept. The Tanya, what's Rabbi Yishmael ben Osham, Rabbi Yochanan Mebroka? What about, we have a case, and this is also coming up Pesach, so the Gemara loves it. When you have the Karban Pesach, is brought on what day? The 14th of Nisan. Now, if the 14th of Nisan falls out on Shabbos, which it does sometimes. Remember, when we have, right, we always have chametz on. Remember, you have to eat your meals on Erev Pesach when it's on Shabbos. We love that. That I don't remember, but anyways, okay. So when that happens, you obviously have to bring Karban Pesach on Shabbos, right? Now, bringing the Karban Pesach is involved many steps of Chilul Shabbat. Right, you have to shecht it. Obviously, it's Chilul Shabbat. You have to carry. There's a lot of steps, but you don't cook it on Shabbat, right? Because you could wait till Motzei Shabbat, and then you could re-roast your Karban Pesach. But the problem is that when you shecht an animal, generally you have to start flaying, I think is the word, the animal, or you take the skin off, the hide off. I guess otherwise it gets ruined, or you can't get out the parts, or it sticks to it. Anyways, you start taking off, doing hefshet of the animal. And the question is, do you do the complete hefshet on Shabbat, or do you do most of it and leave half of it to do after Shabbat? So do you get it started and minimize the Chilul Shabbat you do, or do you do the whole thing the way you're supposed to do it? So let's read the Braita. If the 14th of Nisan falls out on Shabbat and you have to do Karban Pesach, mafshid et Pesach ana chazeh. You should flay, I think is the word, the Karban Pesach up to the chest, basically. So I guess that gets it started, and therefore it's possible to do it later, right? And where am I up to? Yeah. So and even though normally you would do the whole thing, but on Shabbat you want to minimize the amount of work you're doing. Right? Different Rabbi Shmuel ben Osham ben Yochanan ben Broka. The Chachamim are no, do the whole thing. Achi Yafshid et Kulo. Do the whole thing. So it's the same idea here, where basically Rabbi Shmuel ben Osham ben Yochanan ben Broka is saying you're allowed to be mechalel Shabbat, but minimize what you do. Says the Gemara, that's clearly not the case. Milo Amar Rabbi Shmuel ben Osham ben Yochanan ben Broka hatam kohecha de efshar lo tarchinan. anything. Oh, sorry. This is our statement. Didn't Rabbi Shmuel say there that any place that you can be efshar, meaning you could fulfill what you need to do, which is doing some of the hafshet without the whole thing. You're not matriach and do the whole melacha on Shabbat. Hachanami given efshar lo tarchinan. Since you can do the isaron of solet from 3 sa'ah with a lot of energy, then you're not matriach to do 5 sa'ah to cut down more. Says, well, not necessarily. Maybe it is not the same opinion. It's Dilma, Adkan look, Rabbi Shmuel Bacha. Maybe Rabbi Shmuel only said in our Mishnah that you should only have 3 sa'av solet on Shabbat, Ella deleka bizayon kachim. There's no downside to you working a little bit harder to getting your isaron out of 3 sa'ah instead of 5 sa'ah. But in the case of the animal that you're flaying in the Beit HaMikdash, avahatam dika bizayon kachim, there it's disgusting. And Rashi says it looks like a slaughterhouse, right? It looks like a nevela, right? So Rashi actually says it looks like a nevela, right? That you're basically you pulled off the skin of half the animal that's sitting in the Beit HaMikdash. Remember, there are hundreds of these, maybe thousands of these, with their skin still attached. It looks disgusting, right? Like maybe on top of Daf Samach Daled, there Rabbi Shmuel of our Mishnah would hold like the Rabbanan that you should skin the whole animal on Shabbat, right? Inami, or you could say the opposite way. Adkan look, Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher Yochanan Broka Hatam Ella Dit Avad Leitzarch Gavoa. Right, you've done the thing you need to do for the Beit Hamikdash, meaning you skin the animal enough to get out the parts that you put on the mizbeach, and you don't need v'lo tzarcha chuli Shabbat. You don't need to be mechalel Shabbat because the rest of taking off the skin is just so that you can eat it tonight, but you'll do that later. Aval hacha by mincha delot avid leitzarch gavoa, right? Where at the time that you're cutting down the grain, you haven't yet done the karba mincha, right? So maybe then, because the mitzvah is ahead of you, you can do everything necessary for the mitzvah, right? So therefore, v'tzarich lachuli Shabbat, you have to be mechal Shabbat, ema karabanan svirale. So it is actually not necessarily the same thing. And as I promised, tomorrow at 6 lines from the top, we'll pick it up. Some of us will pick it up together or separate to learn about the next case. Yasher koach.
Wow.
Fun to learn. I'll be back in Riverdale hopefully next Shabbat, but we'll God willing learn together.
Woohoo.
Shavua tov.
Shavuot tov.
Bye.
Safe drive.
Thank you.